Good day. The last 24 hours have been the witness of a great deal of confusion about the situation in Ukraine and some very, very bizarre stories, all of which, to my mind, is fairly typical of any war, but perhaps of this one in particular. Firstly, just a few days after we got news that a Ukrainian attempt to advance in southern Ukraine towards Kherson region had been repelled with heavy losses. Over the course of yesterday, we were getting a whole flood of further reports of more attempts by the Ukrainians to advance towards Kherson region, which and also to carry out some kind of river crossing of the Ingulets River. This is the same Ingulets River, one of those three bridges that the Ukrainians have been attacking with HIMARS missiles. It is that river which one of those bridges crosses. Anyway, within a few hours, we got further reports that the attempt to cross the Ingulets River by these Ukrainian troops had been unsuccessful. Two of their landing craft were destroyed. The group was dispersed. And again, the Ukrainians suffered more losses. Now, I've come round increasingly to the view that there is little real rationale for a Ukrainian attack on Kherson region. I want to stress again, I said this many times, but I'm going to say it one more time, I'm not a military specialist, but I've now heard an explanation of the difficulties the Ukrainians would face in this area from a senior Russian official who is one of the chief administrators in Kherson region. Now, obviously what he says about the problems the Ukrainians face must be taken with great care, with great caution, but for what it's worth, he seems to me to be talking sense. He says essentially this: the Ukrainians now lack air cover, so that any Ukrainian forces that attempt to advance on Kherson region would be quickly attacked from the air. Moreover, this is an area of Ukraine which is flat, relatively flat. It's steppe land. There's not much cover, so the Ukrainian troops would be detected fairly quickly. So that means that any Ukrainian advance on Kherson region is likely to be detected fast. It's likely to be the target of artillery and missile and aircraft strikes. And there's not much cover behind which the Ukrainians can hide or which they can exploit in order to continue their advances. So that all but guarantees that the Ukrainians will suffer heavy losses and be repulsed in any one of these attempts. Now, it seems to me that the Ukrainians did have some kind of a plan in order to attack Kherson region, which is, of course, that they were aiming to knock out these three bridges, the Antonovsky Bridge in Kherson, the railway bridge across the dam a little further upstream on the Dnieper River, and this new bridge, this third bridge on the Ingulets River. But as I've discussed many times, it's not actually so straightforward to destroy bridges. They are heavily engineered infrastructure, and it takes more than the relatively small missiles that the HIMARS systems that the Ukrainians possess. It takes more than just a few of these missiles to do serious damage to large structures like this. In fact, I think by general consensus, the dam and the railway bridge that runs on top of it are, as far as the Ukrainians are concerned, beyond their effective reach to do serious damage to. Now, having said that, the Ukrainians have tried, and we've seen, in the case of both of the two road bridges, the Antonovsky Bridge and the bridge over the Ingulets River, proof that they have managed to do some real damage to the roadway. But In neither case has it been sufficient, apparently, to close the bridges completely to traffic, and the Russians are in the process of doing repairs. Now, in theory, the Ukrainians could continue to launch more and more HIMARS systems against these bridges until those bridges were destroyed, a process which some would say would take 1 to 2 weeks, on the assumption that these bridges were attacked every single day. The trouble is, as we've also seen, the Russians have an extremely advanced air defense system. They've been bringing more of these air defense systems, the S-400 radar system, the Pantsir system, all of those into operation. And it's becoming increasingly difficult for HIMARS missiles to get through. And the latest reports suggest that the Ukrainians have now given up their attempts to destroy the Antonovsky Bridge. So, given that this is so, given that it's starting to look as if these Ukrainian attempts to destroy these bridges are going to be unsuccessful, it seems to me that it makes less and less sense for the Ukrainians to continue these attacks, these sporadic attacks on Kherson region. The Russian forces west of the Dnieper, it seems, are unlikely to be cut off from resupply, and Ukrainian troops who attempt to attack them are, for the reasons that Russian officials said, in extreme danger, since they are dangerously exposed to Russian artillery and missile strikes. Very early in the war, back in early March, I remember seeing some pictures from the steppe lands near Kherson, which involved some of the early military clashes that were taking place there. And they were really rather disturbing, showing pictures of large numbers of Ukrainian troops killed and spread out across the steppe. And I fear, to be straightforward about this, that the same thing is happening now with these latest attacks on Kherson region. And yet, the Ukrainians are not giving up. The very latest reports even suggest that Ukrainian troops are being redeployed to Kherson region from the Donbass. Now, over the last few hours, there's been news of further Russian advances in the Donbass. They're not spectacular. There was a report earlier that the Uglegorsk thermal power station, which is a major fortress in this area held by the Ukrainians, had been overrun by the Russians. That is premature. It's not yet happened. But other places, other settlements have been captured by the Russians. And it's clear that Ukrainian defenses in this part of the war, in Donbass, are buckling, with some predicting that over the next week or so, they will start to break down. So it doesn't seem to make much military sense to transfer troops from Donbass, where there is an ongoing military crisis, and to transfer them to Kherson, just throw them into offensives against Kherson region, which will only result in most of those troops being either wounded or killed, and where in any event, any Ukrainian attack is bound to suffer very heavy losses. And that begs the question of why is this war being conducted in this strange way? Why are the Ukrainians, as I've asked many times rhetorically, clinging on to every single millimetre of land that they can in Donbass, suffering disproportionately heavy losses as they try to do so? And why are the Ukrainians constantly talking about an offensive in Kherson region, which, well, all the indications up to now might be extremely costly for them, and which, for the moment at least, look unlikely to succeed? Well, I think that the explanation is not to be found in Ukraine. It is to be found in the West. And it's clear to me, increasingly, that Western governments, perhaps above all the British government, but also to some extent the US government, are very keen on these Ukrainian moves. They're effectively leveraging the military and diplomatic support they have been giving to Ukraine in order to micromanage the war. And it is they who are apparently insisting that Ukraine hold on as long as it can and beyond to every millimetre territory in Donbass. And it is they, that is to say Western governments, who are pressing Ukraine all the time to launch these misguided offensives in Kherson region. And it's not difficult to understand why. We've had a whole slew of economic news over the last few hours. There's been reports coming from Germany that business confidence in Germany is collapsing and that growth in Germany is now running at about 0.1% in the last quarter. In other words, Germany is on the brink of an economic recession, and all the indications are that it's going to be a very severe economic recession. There's also news that the United States could very well already be in recession, even as the inflation crisis in the United States, and by the way in Germany too, continues. And of course all of this is causing growing unhappiness on the part of Western electorates. And of course, even though in the West, the media, the political class try to the extent that they can to separate the issue of Ukraine from that of the economic crisis that is now hurtling in our direction, it's unlikely that many people are fooled. So it's not perhaps surprising that Western governments in this kind of situation are insisting that Ukraine hold to every piece of land for as long as it can, and are pressing Ukraine to launch counteroffensives which make little military sense than I can see, but give the increasing appearance of being some kind of a desperate quest in order to achieve some kind of victory or something that can be packaged as a victory. Consider, for example, the disproportionate amount of attention that's been given to that quasi-battle over Snakes Island. I mean, reading about articles which claim that the Ukrainians have liberated Snakes Island. They haven't liberated Snakes Island. Nobody lives there, and there are no Ukrainian troops there. Any Ukrainian troops that try to establish themselves there would very, very quickly be overrun or shelled out of existence by the Russian military. Snakes Island is untenable either by the Ukrainians or by the Russians. But it's essential from the point of view of Western governments to pretend that Ukraine won some victory over Snakes Island, because it's necessary to convey to Western publics the image of Ukraine successfully resisting Russia in order to justify to Western electorates continued Western military support for Ukraine. And as a result, we see what is really happening, because this Western support is coming at this enormous cost of Western micromanagement of the war, and that's leading to Ukraine making decisions, military decisions, which I sense the Ukrainian military command is unhappy with, and which is causing huge Ukrainian losses, in other words, dead Ukrainian lives, and which is hastening on the pending collapse of Ukraine. And that collapse isn't just happening on the battlefields. As I discussed a few days ago, Ukraine has now gone into default on its debt, on its foreign debt. It's asked for a restructuring. There seems to be some reluctance on the part of its creditors to agree to a restructuring. It's also had to devalue its currency. And the Ukrainian natural gas company, Naftogaz, the state company that runs the pipelines that crisscross Ukraine, it too is now facing immense financial pressures, and it too looks like it's on the brink of some kind of insolvency experience or episode. And of course, all of this is happening as Ukrainians both learn about the deaths of their loved ones and are seeing their own economic position deteriorate. Gonzalo Lira, who frequently appears on our programs on the Duran, is now suggesting that President Zelensky's position in Ukraine is becoming increasingly precarious. I can't confirm that one way or the other. We did have all that strange business about the attempted the purge of all those Ukrainian officials from the SBU, the Ukrainian intelligence and counterintelligence service. And we've also seen rumors of an assassination attempt on Zelensky, though the details are obscure. And we've also heard mutterings, including one irate comment from one Ukrainian site that I've seen, that Zelensky could be facing more protests before very long against his government in Maidan Square. Well, I'm not in a position to say, as I said, whether Zelensky's regime is tottering or not. But it seems to me that irrespective of what's happening to Zelensky himself, Ukraine is tottering. And again, let me repeat, the underlying reason for this is this. Now that Western governments have invested so much in Ukraine, they have acquired a disproportionate say over what goes on there. And the result is that Ukraine is being pushed into decisions, including military decisions, which are perhaps unwise, which Ukrainians themselves might not choose to make, and which will in the end turn out to be bad for Ukraine. So Western help is not helping Ukraine at all. It's harming Ukraine. Now, I think this is something that both Ukrainians and Westerners need to understand, that Western decisions, that Western attempts to micromanage this war, that not only are not helping Ukraine, but are doing harm to Ukraine. And that if the West were to detach itself from this conflict, were to allow Ukraine to make its own decisions, or at least to allow Ukrainians to start making their own decisions, then the outcome would be better for Ukraine, certainly, and also if it resulted in peace, it might be better in the end for Western societies if it brought about the end of this economic war, which is now causing so much damage. Anyway, that's my view of the situation. I appreciate others will disagree. It might seem counterintuitive that Western military aid to Ukraine is actually bad militarily for Ukraine, but these latest moves by Ukraine do make me wonder about the sense, the wisdom of much that is happening, And I will say that to the extent that I'm informed about what happened in South Vietnam in the 1960s and early 1970s, it was much the same there, with decisions increasingly being made by Americans and imposed on the South Vietnamese, and often turning out extremely badly for the South Vietnamese. Anyway, to move on, it may very well be that it's this very strange problem caused by this flood of Western aid distorting Ukraine's decision making that explains this utterly bizarre story that we're now hearing about the Ukrainian intelligence service, the SBU, trying to bribe Russian pilots apparently to defect with their aircraft. I mean, let me say straight away, things like this have happened in the past, way back in the early 1970s. What was then the most advanced fighter jet in the Soviet Air Force, the MiG-25, left the Soviet Union. One of them left the Soviet Union and landed in Japan, and the pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Belenko, then defected, and the US were able to get a fast haul of intelligence about how the MiG-25 operated. I don't know that it turned out very well, by the way, because it caused the Soviets to carry out significant changes to the MiG-25, and the resulting aircraft which appeared, the MiG-31, seems to have been much more effective, but that's another issue, and I'm not going to pretend that I know much about these kind of fighter jet developments. But there does seem to have been a case where a pilot, a Soviet pilot, was persuaded to defect. He might have been paid to do so, who knows, and it did result in an intelligence windfall. But that was long ago, and everything that I'm hearing about this particular latest affair seems to have been utterly and completely bizarre. Anyway, the FSB quickly got wind of it, and it all seems to have unraveled. And I say that, and what makes it all particularly bizarre is that it seems that a member of the Bellingcat media group seems to have been involved on the Ukrainian side in this affair in some strange way, and he's confirmed that it really did happen, and he's saying that he wasn't a direct participant but only a witness, which seems extremely strange to me. Why would one want a witness to supervise or to participate or to watch a complicated intelligence operation like this? But anyway, that's putting all that aside. But anyway, he's no doubt got his explanations to offer. But anyway, he confirms that something did happen, even though he says that it was all an elaborate sting by the Ukrainians to smoke out Russian agents, which seems to me, I mean, I simply can't get my brain around this affair at all. But I wonder, again, whether this episode isn't another example of intelligence in Ukraine, the SBU, being pushed into carrying out extremely bizarre operations at the instigation of its Western partners. Just suggesting, and if this affair really was a complete failure, as it seems it might have been, then that might partly explain, that might be another reason for this purge that we see being carried out in the SBU, and it might also perhaps explain, if the SBU really is riddled with Russian agents, why this madcap operation failed. But anyway, There we go. I'm not going to say more about this. It doesn't make a huge amount of sense to me. But we see, as I said, how things are not going right in Ukraine, either on the military front or on the economic front, or apparently on the intelligence front. And what does the United States now do? It seems to me that it's getting itself now sucked into another crisis, this time with China. Nancy Pelosi is due to visit Taiwan in August. The Chinese have taken extreme exception to this, and there's been an report in the Financial Times, not really denied in the United States, that the Chinese have given very strong warnings, the strongest warnings they've ever given, that they regard this trip by Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan as completely unacceptable, and that they do not buy at all the American explanation that this is a private initiative of Nancy Pelosi's and that she's not a member of the administration, she's the House Speaker, she's not a member of the executive branch, and that she's going there off her own bat to do, well, it's not clear what exactly. The Chinese media, the Global Times newspaper, for example, have made it absolutely crystal clear that they believe that she's going there as an unofficial emissary of the United States, of the US government, in other words, of the administration. And the Chinese are giving very, very strong warnings that there will be consequences if this trip happens. Now, it seems the report in the Financial Times suggested that there's now alarm in the US government about all of this. There's worries and speculations about what China might be prepared to do. There's suggestions that the Chinese might even intervene militarily to stop Nancy Pelosi going to Taiwan, that this might trigger some kind of armed conflict over Taiwan. Well, I'm not going to try and guess what's in the Chinese mind. I don't think there's any point in doing so. I've no access to that kind of information and intelligence. It seems to me that just as Russia keeps its secrets firmly locked in the Kremlin, so China keeps its secrets firmly locked in Zhongnanhai, the Chinese leaders' compound in Beijing. And I don't have access either to the thinking in the Kremlin or to the thinking in Zhongnanhai. I don't know what the Chinese are going to do. But that the US is now rattled and concerned about all of this astonishes me. What did the US think would happen if Pelosi went to Taiwan and were to tell the Taiwanese, presumably in some form on behalf of the United States, that the US stands behind them against China? Did they think that the Chinese would not respond, given how strongly the Chinese feel about Taiwan? Do people in Washington think that China is bluffing? I've always said that this is a fundamental mistake about China. Never think the Chinese are bluffing, and never on your part think you can get away with bluffing China. I've said several times in broadcasts that if the iron law, the first law of war, is don't march on Moscow, the first law of diplomacy is don't bluff Beijing, because your bluff will always be called. If, as it seems to me must be the case, because I can't believe that this administration is seriously looking for war with China at this particular moment in time, if the idea behind the Pelosi trip was to bluff Beijing, then the people in charge in Washington are violating the first law of diplomacy, because bluffing Beijing never works, because Beijing will always call the bluff, as it is doing now. That ought to have been something that all these clever people in the administration, Mr. Blinken, Mr. Sullivan, all the rest, they should have known about. Their ambassador, the US ambassador in Beijing, who's apparently racing back to Beijing from leave to catch up with this festering crisis, this person should have been warning Washington about this. Perhaps those warnings were indeed made. Perhaps they weren't heeded. The US cannot afford at this time to go on making mistakes like this. Unless, of course, there are some people in Washington who really do want some kind of a armed clash with China over Taiwan. Maybe they believe that the US Navy is up to this, that it's capable of fighting China close to Chinese territory. Maybe they think that, this is their way of rattling China, of taking steps that will create a crisis there and which will undermine the rule of the Chinese Communist Party and of President Xi Jinping. If so, then I think they're living in delusions. And I have to say that I think that these delusions are so profound and so dangerous that I can't believe that even in this administration there are people who really hold to them. But I ask again, you have a massive crisis in Ukraine. It's not turning out well for you. You have an economic crisis close to home. All the indicators are now flashing recession in the United States. All the indicators are now flashing not just recession, but outright crisis in Europe. Surely at this time you should mind your step carefully and try to avoid getting sucked into some kind of conflict with China of all countries over Taiwan. I finding it increasingly difficult to understand this administration. People like Larry Johnson and Robert Barnes and others point to the extraordinary disorganization within it. I've spoken myself about the lack of coherence at its center, with a president who is, shall we say, I'm going to be very careful in what I say, semi-detached from decision making. It's indisputable that he takes more time off than apparently any one of his immediate predecessors. But regardless, it's becoming increasingly necessary that someone should call time. Otherwise, before very long, something is going to go very badly smash. I say that because, of course, in a sense, it already has done. I mean, what is Ukraine if not a growing debacle and a massive debacle? But if you want to look for a crisis that will cap Ukraine, well, Taiwan, starting something in Taiwan, is the way to do it. And this, of course, comes just a few weeks, a few days after President Biden, whilst visiting Israel, seemed to give the Israelis a green light for airstrikes on Iran, starting yet another crisis in the Middle East, in that always exceptionally dangerous part of the world, all in the middle of an energy crisis. Well, I don't know what more I can say about all of this, other than that I've never known a situation, a global situation, that makes me more nervous than this one. I do hope someone in Washington, there is still someone in Washington, who has the objective grasp of reality to see how badly things are going, who understands that this attempt to run the Ukrainian war from a distance is actually turning out badly for the United States, and not to mention Ukraine, at almost every turn, and who also understands that the United States needs a war in the Gulf against Iran and a war in the Pacific against China, like it needs a hole in the head. And that's being extremely measured again in what I'm going to say. I'm starting to wonder very seriously whether in Washington there is anyone like that there. Anyway, on these rather bleak thoughts, I'm going to end this program today. Thank you for joining me. I will say that I expect that we're going to see some major developments in Donbass over the course of this week. I will try to the extent that I can to discuss what they are, and obviously I'll be trying to keep on top of the global news in other places, ever more complicated and swift and in its changes as it's becoming. Thank you for joining me again today. Remember, you can find us on other platforms, on Locals, on Rumble, on Telegram, and of course you can also support us through Patreon and Subscribestar by going to our shop, buying the great things you will find there. And of course, if you've liked this rather somber video, you can tick the like button, and above all, please remember to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.